Every Friday evening, at 6:42 p.m., the same train pulled into the same platform, and I took the same seat near the middle of the third carriage, facing the window. It had become a ritual without intention, the kind of habit that begins out of convenience and slowly solidifies into something softer, something ritualistic, something that gives the end of a long week its shape. The train was always the same, not new, but not too old, humming with the quiet breath of tired people returning from long days, briefcases tucked between their knees, headphones pulled over ears, screens glowing faintly in their laps. The air inside always smelled faintly of worn upholstery, vending machine coffee, and the trace of some stranger's cologne. And he was always there. Same carriage. Same row. Just one seat across and two forward from mine. He always boarded at the same stop, always entered through the same door, always sat in the same posture, one leg crossed over the other, a book open in his hands but never read for long, as though the pages were a prop rather than a destination. His hair was slightly too long at the collar, his coat always dark and clean, his shoes quietly expensive. And every Friday evening, for nearly 3 months, we shared that hour between the city and the quiet edge of the suburbs in complete silence. He never looked at me directly, not for more than a few seconds. But somehow, it always felt like he knew I was there, in the way he occasionally adjusted his posture when I shifted in my seat, or the way his hand paused on the page whenever I lifted my eyes from the window. I never smiled. Neither did he. But something passed between us, slowly, imperceptibly, like steam rising between two mugs set close on a cold table. It was the kind of almost connection that most people would dismiss. But I began to shape my week around it. I stopped accepting Friday night invitations. I began arriving at the station 10 minutes earlier than necessary, just to be sure I'd have my seat. I wore coats that made me feel quietly elegant, and chose books that made me feel quietly seen. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Only that something about those shared rides, those small glances and slow silences, had begun to feel necessary. And then one Friday, he didn't come. I boarded at the usual time. Took my seat. The train pulled away with its usual lurch. But the space where he always sat remained empty. I kept glancing at the door each time the train paused at a station, waiting for the sound of his shoes, the familiar fold of his coat, the curve of his shoulder leaning back into his seat. But it never happened. That night, the ride felt longer. The lights too bright. The window too quiet. And I realized just how deeply I had grown used to his presence, not as someone I knew, but as someone whose nearness had become part of my week's rhythm, part of the quiet architecture of my solitude. The next Friday, he was there again. Same seat. Same coat. Same stillness. Except this time, just before the train began to move, he looked up. Not by accident. Not quickly. He turned fully in his seat and met my eyes. Held them. And then? He smiled. Not broadly. Not flirtatiously. Just gently. Like someone who had been waiting, too. And when the train began to move, he closed his book. And turned toward me. As if, finally, it was time. His smile that evening stayed with me long after I left the train. It wasn't wide or insistent, not something meant to sweep me into a different life. It was a gesture of quiet recognition, a sign that something wordless and delicate, which had been living between us for weeks in silence, had now shifted, not broken the surface, but moved beneath it with a little more weight. I spent that evening doing ordinary things, putting the kettle on, folding laundry, standing too long by the window, but I wasn't really in the apartment. I was still sitting on the train, still facing him, still holding his gaze across the aisle. The weight of that glance followed me from room to room like a warm current. By the time the next Friday arrived, I had memorized the shape of anticipation, not the sharp, nervous kind that keeps you pacing, but the softer, steadier one that builds slowly and sits quietly in your chest. I left work earlier than I needed to. I walked to the station instead of taking the bus. And when the train arrived and the doors opened with that familiar mechanical sigh, I stepped inside and scanned the carriage before my eyes could finish the thought forming in my chest. He was there. Not in his usual seat. This time, he was in mine, as if by design. He looked up just as I reached the row, and without a word, he stood. It wasn't theatrical. He didn't gesture grandly or explain. He simply moved to the seat beside mine and sat down, leaving the original space for me. There was something in that act, in the silent understanding, the offering, that told me more than any introduction could have. I sat beside him. At first, we didn't speak. The train began to move, carrying us out of the fluorescent grip of the station and into the soft evening light, and our shoulders rested a breath apart. I could feel the warmth of him beside me, the presence of another life close enough to reach, and yet we both let the silence stretch between us, not awkwardly, but with reverence. As if we were both giving space for the moment to shape itself. Eventually, he turned his head slightly, and said, not looking directly at me but toward the window. "You always read the same book. But you never read more than a few pages." I smiled before I answered, not surprised he had noticed, not surprised at all. "I think," I said quietly, "I just needed something to hold while I was waiting." He turned to face me then. Fully. And in his expression, calm, a little tired, but deeply open, I saw something I hadn't let myself believe: he had been waiting, too. After that, the conversation began, slow at first, like a creek thawing after a long winter. We talked about things that don't matter to most people, but matter deeply when you're learning someone by presence, the kind of light we preferred in the mornings, the cities that felt like home even if we'd never lived in them, how the scent of oranges reminded us both of childhood, though for different reasons. He told me he once spent a whole year riding the same route every Friday, even when he didn't have anywhere specific to go, because the hour between departure and arrival was the only time in his life that felt suspended, safe, in between, unhurried. I told him I understood that exactly. We didn't exchange names that night. It felt too early. Or maybe too final. Some part of me felt that knowing his name would change something, take this quiet, pulsing thing and pin it to the ground. What we had didn't need a name yet. It was still breathing. Each Friday after that, we met on the train. Always the same time. Always the same row. The space beside me was his, and I stopped thinking of it as mine alone. We never coordinated. We never texted. We never made a plan. We just showed up. And every time, without fail, he was there. That rhythm, that unspoken reliability, built something between us that neither of us reached out to define, but both of us protected. The conversation deepened. Slowly. In layers. He told me about the years he spent feeling invisible in rooms filled with people. How he preferred evenings to mornings, but loved watching the way the world shifted as light returned. I told him I liked maps, not for direction, but for the way they made everything feel possible. He said he liked the word unfurl. I said I liked gravity, not as force, but as inevitability. He looked at me then, really looked, and whispered, "That's how I feel sitting next to you." One evening, near the end of June, the train stalled between two stops. It was still light outside, and the windows caught the fading gold in a way that made everyone look softer, quieter, real. We sat there for 15 minutes without moving. And in that suspended silence, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded page. "I wrote something," he said, "but I didn't know how to say it out loud." He handed it to me. The note was handwritten, uneven, clearly written in a rush or with uncertainty. I read it slowly, carefully, letting the words settle into me as if they'd been echoing in the space between us all along. "There's something about sharing silence with you that feels more intimate than any conversation I've had in years. I don't know if this is a beginning, or if we've been living inside something longer than either of us realized. But I want to find out, not in a hurry. Not with promises. Just, with time." When I looked up, he wasn't watching me. He was looking down at his hands, waiting. So I took his hand, gently, simply, without performance. And he looked up and smiled. That was the only moment we touched that evening. But it was more than enough. The next week, we broke the rhythm. Not the train, we still met there, but after the ride, we didn't go our separate ways. We walked. Quiet streets. Bare trees. A cafe still open, chairs on tables but lights still glowing. We sat by the window, mugs between our palms. We still didn't exchange numbers. Still no names. We didn't need to rush what already felt real. Now, many months later, I sometimes wonder how long we would have gone on like that, living in the space between strangers and something else, if he hadn't smiled that one evening. If he hadn't chosen to close his book, look up, and finally say what had been waiting in the air between us. But the truth is, I think it was always going to happen. Some people are meant to find each other not in loud rooms or on crowded sidewalks, but in quiet motion, the rhythm of trains, the pause between stations, the stillness of Friday evenings. And when they do, when they finally look up, they know. Not because of how loud it is, but because of how suddenly everything feels still.